I'm gonna get a migraine by the end of the segment. Dude, I got so angry talking about grain last stream. Imagine how angry I'm gonna get actually talking about something like Kevin McCarthy's spineless. Okay, let's get into it. The Republicans in the House are currently in disarray, and there's multiple levels to it, and I can't cover all the levels to it. But I'll try to cover as much as I can, and it's how it's affecting Ukraine. So recently, Kevin McCarthy has been engaged in the fight of his life in the House to try to get either extension, a momentary extension so they can continue to negotiate the budget, or just get through a budget. This is to avoid a government shutdown, which Kevin McCarthy knows would be disastrous for Republicans, but the far right in his party, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, and others, are perfectly willing to do it in order to achieve their political ends. Some of the things they've put forward that is why they're objecting to Kevin McCarthy's budget and why they're objecting to an extension is because none of his budget, I can't believe I'm saying this, deals with wokeness in the military. That's real. That's not a joke. It's the military's too homo, and so we can't fund it until it's less homo. Another aspect of it is people like Marjorie Taylor Greene is saying that they will not vote for any budget or any extension or any defense spending bill that has aid for Ukraine, meaning that she has completely put herself in the obstructionist position on the issue of aid to Ukraine, sinking the budget over it, even though only 15% of congressmen in the House voted against aid for Ukraine the last time it was put up for a vote. This doesn't matter though for people like Rand Paul and others who are saying things like this: I will oppose any effort to hold the federal government hostage for Ukraine funding. I will consent to expedite passage. I will not consent to expedite passage of any spending measure that provides any more U.S. aid to Ukraine. Now again, 15% of Congress. 15% of Congress. A small minority in the Senate. You got people like Rand Paul, you got people like Mike Lee, but a strong majority in the Senate and a strong majority of the House support aid to Ukraine and are fine with it being in the defense spending bill. So when he says that the government is holding people hostage by including Ukraine funding in the spending bill, $24 billion in Ukraine funding in the defense spending bill, that's just nonsense. The majority of legislators are in favor of aid to Ukraine. The majority of Americans are in favor for aid to Ukraine. The votes for it exist. Votes for it have succeeded multiple times. The last vote where people like him have tried to stop it, only 15% of Congress voted in favor of legislation to try to stop aid for Ukraine. Even though there's this civil war in the Republican Party over this issue, it was 33% of Republicans who voted against it. Still not even a majority of Republicans. And not a single Democrat voted in favor of it. No independents as well, as far as I'm aware. And so how is Ukraine aid holding the government hostage and them hostage, and not the other way around, where they're holding aid to Ukraine hostage and they're holding Kevin McCarthy and the Republican Party hostage? They're trying to shift the blame to Ukraine aid when the blame for government shutdown solely lies within the Republican Party. You're not being held hostage, you're holding the country hostage over this government shutdown. Man, God, I don't like Rand Paul. Anyway, he's going through these scuffles, they're not voting for it, and we're about 8 days from a government shutdown. And so Kevin McCarthy is getting increasingly frustrated. We're even getting some reports that he's starting to really lash out. Where at one point it was suggested, and this is the big thing that gives a lot of leverage to these far-right legislators, it was suggested that maybe they would do a recall vote since they're unable to pass a defense spending bill and they're unable to find compromise with these far-right legislators. Kevin McCarthy responded by saying, introduce the fucking vote then. Not that happy, not that, chipper, but he does have a good reason to be angry about that. And when I say good reason, I mean a legislator would have a good reason to be angry about the rules that Kevin McCarthy allowed to be set when he was made speaker. So somebody on a basic level can be angry about this because it's stupid, but he also made his own bed and he has to lie on it. When Kevin McCarthy became Speaker of the House, he made an agreement with the far right in the party in order to get enough votes to be made Speaker, because they kept losing over and over and over again. It was the most losses of a speakership vote since, I believe, the late 1900s. Or maybe it was the early 20th century, but either, I believe it was the late 1900s. And in order to get enough votes to become Speaker of the House, he made an agreement that any one congressman, any one person in Congress could call a recall vote at any time. And that they can do a recall vote in the House to see if Kevin McCarthy could be removed as Speaker of the House. That was giving immense leverage to the individual members of the party, but especially those on the fringe right who might be willing to utilize that if he didn't cave to their demands on things like balancing the budget, on things like, cutting aid to Ukraine, on things like targeting abortion access, or any other number of issues. Wokeness in the military is often brought up. And so this has put him in a stranglehold where he's trying desperately to get this defense spending bill through, doing meeting after meeting after meeting. But as the clock runs out, we don't see any end in sight, and a government shutdown is right around the corner. And we're about to talk about how this is affecting Ukraine and how this is affecting the war in Ukraine in a moment. But I do also want to just say what a government shutdown could do to the United States. I am an American. I care about the United States. I care about my people. And I especially care about government shutdowns because I grew up in a federal government household. I'm sorry, boys. It's true. I'm a Fed. I know the theories say I'm the grandson of the CIA director, William Burns, but I'm actually the grandson of two hardworking federal employees, my grandmother, who was a government research cook, and my grandfather, who was a machinist for the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. And a Marine before that, but a machinist for the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. And when these government shutdowns happened, federal employees, the ones that are considered quote-unquote non-essential, are furloughed. And what that means is those people go home without pay, sit there not working, and the services that they were maintaining in communities across America are shut down. For example, if in 8 days they're not able to come to an agreement to either extend negotiations by a month and pass a continuation, or pass a defense spending bill, then over 400 parks across the country will be forced to turn away visitors. Roughly 850,000 to 2.1 million workers could be furloughed, and many workers will be furloughed. That's just the range of how many could be furloughed. The Agricultural Department may only be able to send out assistance for 30 days after the start of the shutdown. Air traffic controllers and TSA agents are going to be ordered, that's right, ordered, to work without pay due to the national security importance and transportation importance and just importance for the state of our airlines and, transportation sustaining. Our economy will start to break down if we can't use airlines, we can't use planes. We're a pretty big country. And so while we're about to talk about this mostly in the aspect of Ukraine, I do want to highlight some instances on how it's negatively going to affect workers across the country. It's going to negatively affect our national parks. It's going to negatively affect TSA agents. It's going to negatively affect Social Security and Medicaid. It's going to negatively affect SNAP benefits. It's going to be really a real disaster, as it is every time. That's not even to talk about the danger in public trust and investor trust when we play footsie with shutting down the government every once in a while. If you're somebody who wants to invest in public bonds in the United States, you want to trust the federal government is good on its word when it comes to paying its debts. It's part of the reason why the American economy is relatively so strong. It's part of the reason why our dollar is so strong. And if we were to lose that public confidence, if we were to lose the confidence of investors, and stuff like this does not help that, that could create an economic catastrophe. Definitely when a lot of our spending is relying upon things like being the world reserve currency. But the more chaos we cause, the more economic chaos we cause, the less people will feel confident in trusting the United States with those sort of responsibilities or wanting to buy bonds that we need in order to do government programs. Anyway, putting that aside, coming back around to Ukraine, because Kevin McCarthy is letting the tail wag the dog, because he is being led by the nose by the far right in his party. And it was Jim Clyburn who said the tail's wagging the dog. I want to give him credit for that. Because of that, it's also affecting our support for Ukraine. Why? Well, because these far-right senators, this 15% of Congress, is taking point ahead of the 85% of duly elected representatives and pressuring him to try to cut aid for Ukraine. And so Kevin McCarthy is trying to find ways to appease them so he can get a defense spending bill passed or a continuation. And one of the ways that they appease them is through declining an offer to host a forum for Zelensky between Zelensky and lawmakers in the House. Zelensky, when he came to Capitol Hill, he's in the United States right now. I believe he's about to head home very soon. He came to the United States to meet with injured servicemen who are going through rehabilitation, to speak at the United Nations in New York, and also to meet with American officials so they can talk to them about the Ukrainian counteroffensive, what Ukraine needs when it comes to weapons and material, and address any concern that legislators and the United States government might have about either aid to Ukraine or any other issues. And what I've always been led to believe about Republicans is that about the Republicans opposing aid to Ukraine is a lot of this is an issue of transparency. You know, there could be money laundering afloat. And how do we know this aid is really being used to fight the Russians when everyone knows Ukraine is the most corrupt country to ever exist on God Green's earth, right? And so I was of the thought that forums like this between Zelensky and these legislators could give an opportunity for these people to bring their concerns directly to Zelensky. So they could go to them and say, hey, what type of monitoring is done to make sure that our weapons are used on the battlefield? Hey, how much aid, how much has American aid actually supported the counteroffensive? Or, hey, we heard that the counteroffensive is being bogged down. Is that true? Is that not true? Is there some nuance to this? They could bring these concerns to him. They could get some of the transparency that they've been requesting. But no, they don't want that. That apparently isn't the issue. And so Kevin McCarthy is caving on not allowing him to speak to House members. They are cutting down on the transparency while also railing aid to Ukraine for a lack of transparency. Okay, whatever. Anyway, this doesn't mean that Zelensky did not meet with House members. He did meet with House members. He actually met with them in the National Archives, but he had to go off the grounds of the Capitol and have a separate meeting at a different building that not all legislators went to. And certainly the far-right legislators who have questions and need to know the answers about the war, they weren't there. They could have gone there. They could have listened to what he had to say. They could have attempted to talk. They could have done something, but they didn't. Why is that? I've talked about this before, but I don't believe people like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Matt Gaetz or any of the new up-and-coming people who have jumped out into the field in the Republican race like Vivek Ramaswamy. I don't think, or people like Tucker Carlson, even though they're not a legislator, but people of this ilk, the problem isn't that they don't have enough information about what's going on and they want to be properly informed so they can know more about, you know, how the aid is being delivered. That's not the problem. The problem isn't we need to be more informed on this and we would like to have this transparent. That's not the real problem. The problem for them is that if they actually have Zelensky come and talk to congressmen, and they have Zelensky, who's a very good public speaker, a very good advocate on behalf of the Ukrainian people, the more access he has and the more times he can make his case, the better his case sounds, and the more Americans and legislators on Capitol Hill will continue to support Ukraine's struggle. I've talked about this in the past, but there are studies showing that the more Americans know about the details of the war, whether it be Russian losses, whether it be territorial gains that the Ukrainians have made, capturing over 50% of the territory that that the Russians captured since 2022 and started their 2022 invasion, the more they know about the war, you see 10 to 15 to 20 point jumps among Americans for support to Ukraine. You're talking about a jump from 55 to 70%. The biggest jump is actually, and this is what I think scares them, it's among Republicans. A lot of Republicans have been led to believe that the Ukrainians don't have a chance in hell. and that it's a completely pointless effort, and that because of things like Tucker Carlson has said, for every one Russian soldier that dies, 7 Ukrainian soldiers die, on the most popular right-wing cable news show, actually no, the most popular cable news show in America, period, he was able to push those types of lies, making people think that there was no chance in hell. That, of course, was a lie, though. Those came from obviously photoshopped documents that Tucker Carlson did not either bother to fact-check or did not care to fact-check because he wanted to lie. He wanted to sow that narrative. And was Fox News going to pull the leash on him before he cost them $850 million? Probably not, because at the time, he was their cash cow, and Rupert Murdoch has no values. I don't even know if the man has a soul. Point is, they don't want him on Capitol Hill because Zelensky is a good advocate, and the more access he has, the better he will be in making the case. Much better than someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who screeches in the Capitol and convinces nobody outside of the most diehard right-wing maniacs. It's not going to people like Lauren Boebert can't make a case better than him. Even propagandists like Tucker Carlson can't make a case better than him. Not only due to the lack of knowledge that they have generally about the war, the region, and the history of Ukraine, and actually what it's like on the ground, but because Zelensky's, quite frankly, a much better speaker than most of them, and the only one that might give him some run for his money is Tucker Carlson, and he's not even one of the people involved in the story. I do also want to highlight, quickly, 2 things. Number one, this is not in really relation to what we're talking about. Well, it is in relation, but not super important to the story, but I thought it was pretty cool. Because he visited the National Archives and did this instead of his visit on the Capitol, he also got to see some documents in the National Archives. And look what he said in the replies. Among the documents I saw today at the National Archives was Abraham Lincoln's telegram to General Grant, an inspiring document. Hold on with a bulldog grip and chew the choke as much as possible. President Lincoln's words reflect the courage and faith that helped America. He's quoting General Grant. That was pretty cool. You know, I don't like to like soy out over, yay, America, but that was a red-blooded Yankee moment if I've ever had one. A quote of General Grant, and a good quote of General Grant too. But even though they didn't have a meeting in the House, they did have a meeting in the Senate, because Mitch McConnell is a very, very experienced legislator, and he's not stupid enough to allow the tail to wag the dog, even if he's actively decomposing in front of everyone. And so Zelensky met with all 100 American senators, answered their questions, talked to them about what problems they could possibly have with aid, how the counteroffensive is going. And I want to just show you a little bit of audio from somebody who was sitting in on that meeting. And this is from a Republican, which is the party where we're seeing the most resistance from aid. This is what he had to say about the closed door meeting that they had, which of course, we're not going to get all the details. It was a closed door meeting. Probably some secretive intelligence was shared in that meeting, to some extent. Stuff that is not for public consumption. But this is what a Republican had to say about that closed door meeting.
That he's winning, but that I asked, what do you need? What's your plan for victory? What do you need? 2 things in particular: air cover, that would be F-16s, and the ATACMS. He needs the longer range artillery to hit Crimea, where the Iranian drones are coming out of. He doesn't have that. Right now, his troops are going in with no air cover. They have to take the mines by hand at nighttime. We wouldn't send our troops into that situation. So we need to give them everything they need. If this administration won't give it to them, then I submitted that we write it in our appropriations bill. We write the weapons that he asked for, that this administration won't give. We write that in our appropriations bill. And I think
Note, this was before we now have been told that Biden will be sending over ATACMS. A small amount of ATACMS, but this was before that.
Democrats at the table, whether it be Steny Hoyer to Nancy Pelosi to the whip and Chairman Mr. Meeks, we all agree.
Now, did he say anything about the aid package, the $24 billion aid package, and what it would mean for Ukraine?
Of course. I mean, they need it, and they're going to get it. I said, the majority support this. I know there's some dissension on both sides, but I said a war of attrition.
By the way, that's bullshit. There is not some dissension on both sides. Not a single Democrat voted in that bill. It was Matt Gaetz's bill against aid to Ukraine. Every single person who voted in favor of that bill, all 77 legislators, were Republicans. Every single one. The one time we even had a sniff of someone being like, well, maybe the aid isn't so good, was that letter that was released and then retracted like a year ago by some progressive legislators. It was retracted. They said it was actually not confirmed for release, and they apologized, understanding that it was not really a nuanced letter, and it didn't really address a lot of the issues involved with trying to make peace with the Russians. And since then, people like AOC and Premier Jayapal have been pretty consistent, and I would say those are probably the most left-wing members of the House, have been pretty consistent in considering to support Ukraine. In fact, John Fetterman recently made a tweet. That's probably one of the most powerful, not most powerful, but one of the most progressive senators in the Senate. He said that he will stop dressing in these hoodies and his shorts that he's become famous for because he wears hoodies and shorts while everybody else wears suits in the Senate. He said he'll stop wearing it. He'll back down to the Republicans who are angry that the dress code was changed so he could wear hoodies and shorts. He said he'll change it if Republicans finally get consistent on supporting Ukraine. So this isn't a both sides issue. This is a one side issue. It's his party, but obviously he doesn't want to acknowledge that.
Is not going to win this. And that's what Putin wants, because he wants to break the will of the American people and the Europeans. We can't afford a war of attrition. We need a plan for victory, and we need to do it soon.
Will you insist on putting the aid in the CR? Will you insist on getting that aid into the CR?
We will get it done, and there are a lot of political machinations right now, but I assure you we're going to get it passed, because this cause, when I was in Poland seeing the refugees coming out, they said this is like 1939, Hitler invading Poland. This man has moral courage and moral clarity, and the will of the Ukrainian people is far stronger than the will of the Russians.
Okay, that's enough of that. The point is, though, there still was a meeting in the Senate, but there wasn't a meeting in the House because McCarthy had to cuck himself to the far right. I also want to say that there was a brief moment. There was a brief moment where we were getting reports like this. This is just from 2 days ago. Potential U.S. government shutdown could put Ukraine aid at risk. The possibility of an impending government shutdown in the U.S. may threaten to disrupt the flow of military aid to Ukraine, a Pentagon spokesperson stated to Politico in an article published on September 19th. Disputes about the future spending, both within the Republican Party and across party lines, have prevented an agreement that will continue to fund the government before the end of the fiscal year on September 30th, 2023. If no bills are passed, the federal government will effectively shut down with an exemption from matters of national security. It remains unclear whether military aid for Ukraine, which includes training programs for Ukrainian soldiers and the shipment of arms, would be included in this exception. Deadlock on a variety of issues, many of which unrelated to Ukraine, has so far prevented the signing of an agreement that would prevent the impending shutdown. However, due to a previously reported accounting error by the Pentagon that allowed for an addition, also, this was basically an out they could use earmarked aid. But point is, training of Ukrainian soldiers on Abrams, certain aid that was being sent over to Ukraine, that was all put in the air on whether it would be sent over. And when these reports came out, there was basically no response from Kevin. There was no response from the far-right senators who are holding the government hostage at the moment. Nothing. They didn't care. There are Ukrainian soldiers on training camps right now that the quicker they get home, the faster they can get into the fight and try to push harder against the Russians, try to liberate the territory, end this war as soon as possible, and defend their villages. And they're willing to throw all that under the table, throw that all out the window, screw all that over, sabotage it, and undermine the war effort so they can stop wokeness in the military. They will undermine months and months and months of work and build-up over almost a 2-year effort to push against the Russian invasion so they can fight against the gays in the military. It's silly. It would be something that I would laugh at if it didn't also involve the deaths of people overseas. The deaths of people, I'm saying overseas, not overseas for me, but the deaths of people in Ukraine. I will say, though, thankfully, After a meeting between Zelensky and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, the Pentagon has determined that Ukraine training and support exempt from potential government shutdown. And this is good, but there's an asterisk here that isn't included in the title. If federal employees are still furloughed, which will undeniably happen if the government shut down, there's a possibility that those government employees being sent home could mean that the transportation of aid could end up undermining shipments still. So even if they've now been able to show that Ukraine aid will be exempt, the furloughing is going to hurt the government across the board. And it's sometimes hard to predict exactly how the government shutdown is going to affect the government across the board. And so the furloughing could still end up undermining aid to Ukraine. Hopefully it won't. Hopefully we'll avoid a shutdown altogether. But because Kevin McCarthy still has yet to metabolize a spine, I doubt we're going to be seeing that in the near future. Right now, we don't have a light at the end of the tunnel.